All right, so hello everyone, I'm Lindsay. I'm the program coordinator at the Longmeadow Adult Center. Thank you for being here. Today we're going to say thank you to Faloka, who sponsored today's event, which is a meeting with Dora Lewis. And we also will be sharing this recording with LCTV and Valley Eye Radio. So thank you so much to Dora Lewis for being here, and she will be joining us.
Oh my, well, excuse me, it seems here that I have more people watching than I thought, and I having my devotions here for a moment. Could I share with you? I hope so. There once was a judge who cared nothing for God or man or woman. And in the same town, there was a widow who constantly came before him demanding justice. Now, for a long time, the judge refused, but in the end, he said to himself, "True, I care nothing for God or man or woman, but this widow is so great a nuisance that I will see her right it before she wears me out with her persistence." I suppose that's not exactly how it's written in the King James, is it? I hope you will forgive my liberty of speech today, but I can think of no better way to explain how women won the right to vote. Just like the widow in the parable, women demanded justice. And we were willing to be annoying and persistent and troublesome until finally, we wore the men out. Now that is how women won suffrage. Oh, suffrage, so that we can all understand together. Suffrage is simply the right to vote. And suffrage can be denied on account of wealth or race or sex. Universal suffrage is when the vote is not restricted by wealth, enfranchisement, and franchising. That is simply giving the right to vote. A suffragist. A suffragist is someone who supports the right to vote, whether it be a woman or a man. But a suffragette, well, if you're in England, that means you are a militant suffragist, willing to take action, deeds, not words. Alice Paul. Alice Paul claims that the suffrage movement is a sort of mosaic. Each of us puts in one little stone, and then you get a great mosaic at the end. That's who I am. I am one little stone in the crooked path to suffrage. I'm just a pebble in a much larger mosaic. Perhaps I should tell you my name, assuming, of course, that I'm not going to be arrested. Well, you know, if you are arrested and you cannot be likely the judge will let you go. Oh, I know what I'm talking about. I've been arrested 4, 5 times. Well, I have served 4 prison sentences. And that's how I earned this pin. This pin is a jail gate. I have been jailed for freedom as a silent sentinel, picketing the White House for the right to vote for a woman. It commemorates this pin 168 militant suffragists. What are you willing to go to jail for? My name. I will tell you my name. I am indeed Mrs. Lawrence Lewis. Dora Lewis. I am the National Woman's Party Ratification Chair for the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, giving women the right to vote. And like the parable and the widow in that parable, I am a persistent widow. I lost my husband when he was killed very tragically by a train. I did not marry again. I raised our young children, Louise, Robert, and Shippen. The path of a widow. The path of a widow is never easy, but as a woman of privilege, the path is undeniably smoother. Larry left his generous estate absolutely under my care. My husband valued me, his wife, as his equal. My children are long since grown. I live in Philadelphia now, and for many years I have devoted my time to the less fortunate. But suffrage, votes for women. Votes for Women became my only cause when the Pennsylvania Women's Suffrage Association made their headquarters in Philadelphia near my home. But perhaps you are wondering today how women became excluded from the vote in the first place. Well, to understand that, we must turn to our great Constitution of the United States, which begins with those magnificent words, "We the people." But who are the people? Let me go and look at some of those amendments with you to remind you that the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution abolished slavery. But it took the 14th Amendment to convey citizenship to the freed slaves, men and women. But then the amendment spoiled the victory by qualifying the right to vote to the male inhabitants. Only men vote. And there it was, in one moment. All persons were citizens, but when it came to the right to vote, men were included, women excluded. Males were citizens with the power to vote, and women were citizens without the power to vote. When it came time for the 15th Amendment, it only guaranteed that Black men could vote, but not any woman, whether she be white or Black. Now, Susan B. Anthony fought for universal suffrage. She fought for the right of everyone to be able to vote. And when she was arrested for voting illegally, she famously said at her trial, "It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union, women as well as men." And then Susan B. Anthony dared to ask the most unnerving of questions. Are women persons? Because if women are persons, then women are citizens. And if women are citizens, then why aren't we given the same rights as men? Now, that is hard to accept. Let me explain it to you in this way. Now, everyone out there, if you're a man, I want you to see that if you're a man, you're going to be given what's in my hand. It's $1. It's a silver dollar. Every man out there, if you're watching, you get $1. But every woman, you get nothing. Well, why does the man get the dollar and the woman get nothing? Because that's the way it's always been. Men are entitled to the dollar and women aren't. So then how can a woman get the dollar? Only by convincing the men that women We deserve the dollar too. Good luck. Jack and Jill have equal will and equal strength and mind. But when it comes to equal rights, poor Jill trails far behind. Well, that is Mother Goose as a Suffragette, 1912. Now, where do you stand today on a woman's right to vote? I'm going to play a little game with you today, a little game with everyone, by asking you to merely, for the sake of argument, pick a color. Now think in your minds here today. You can pick the color yellow, you can pick the color red, you can pick the color purple, and if you want to chat them into Lindsay, I'm sure she'll be able to see that there's some people choosing yellow and there might be some people choosing red, and then some choose purple, and then of course there's probably a lot of you who say, I don't want to choose any color at all. I don't want to play the game. That's fine with me. But if you've thought in your mind, perhaps I'm going to be able to say what you've chosen and tell you who you would represent in a woman's right to vote. And I will begin with those of you who decide, I'm not going to choose a color, I don't want to play that game. Well, if you were one of those and you did not choose a color, then you represent the apathetic multitudes. Oh, that's right. You're going to be the great vast number of people who do not care if a woman receives the right to vote. Now, if you're a woman, maybe you're a little bit too busy with life, and you're too busy to be able to think about worrying about voting. If you're a man, you might be too conventional, and you don't want to stir the pot. You're content not to get involved with women having a right to vote. Awaken from your slumber. The world is changing around you. But if you thought in the mind about the color red, then you will represent the anti-suffragists, or simply as we call them, the antis. The antis have chosen red roses as their symbol. Anti-suffragists are people opposed to women voting, and they are not just men. Many women, especially in the South, are adamantly opposed to receiving the vote. Now, what are some of the antis, the anti-suffragists? What are some of their arguments about women voting? Well, of course, there's many arguments, but I'm going to share only a few of them with you today. And very simply, there are the anti-suffragists who say that women might vote contrary to their husbands. Well, have husbands and wives ever disagreed? Then they will agree to differ. Is that truly a problem? Then the anti-suffragists, they claim that women will vote as their husbands do. Well, then, there's just going to be 2 votes that are cast instead of 1. But there are truly the anti-suffragists who are going to fear the government might be placed under petticoat rule. Oh, well then, up with the petticoats and down with the pants. But more seriously, the anti-suffragists will say, voting, not a privilege. Voting is a duty to be performed. We will agree. Voting is not a privilege. Voting is the right of every citizen. Are these arguments of the anti-suffragists valid? I'll let you decide. Now, the color yellow. If you thought in your mind, well, I like the color yellow. Well, yellow is the traditional color of suffragists, those who want women to vote. Susan B. Anthony adopted the state flower of Kansas, the sunflower, as the symbol of the enfranchisement of women. Kansas was the first state to hold a referendum for women's suffrage. It failed, of course. But the color yellow endured as the color of the suffragists, as seen not just in sunflowers, but also in yellow roses. And when we are lobbying for women's suffrage in the legislatures, that's how we know which legislatures are with us and which are against us. Those legislators who are there, what rose are they wearing in their lapel? Are they wearing yellow or are they wearing red? Or do they have nothing? Nothing. Those are the undecided we want to sway. But if you chose yellow, I'm going to have you represent today the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or simply the National. And Susan B. Anthony was the National's first leader. She famously declared that failure is impossible. Now, very sadly, Miss Anthony did not live to see women receive the vote. But when you think about the National, those suffragists who belong to that group that I've called yellow, you might consider them to be Jeffersonians. I'll explain that. State rights. Their goal is winning suffrage for women state by state, and only a slight nod to the possibility that we could pass a federal amendment. Now, by the year of 1914, how many states have been granting full suffrage to women? Well, I'm going to show you a map from that year. And in that map, you can see that there are different colors. There are states that are black. There are states that are clear. There are states that are hashed or speckled. Those states that are black, they do not offer any suffrage for women. Women cannot vote in any election. All the way up there in Massachusetts, it appears you're hashed. That means you're giving some partial suffrage, local elections. Those women can vote, but not a presidential election. And where are the states that allow women to vote in all elections? All the way out in the West, the new states. By the year of 1914, only 11 states give women the right to vote. Votes for women a success. That's what the National claims. Not in my opinion. In my opinion, going state by state is very, very slow progress. But what about the color purple? If you thought in your mind, oh, I do love purple today, then you have allied yourself with the militant actions of two determined young women. And those women are Miss Alice Paul and Miss Lucy Burns. The young are at the gates. These are American women, highly educated and yes, privileged women, raised in the United States, but who went to England and helped with the suffragettes. Both Alice and Lucy were jailed for their activities, supporting women's right to vote in England. Deeds, not words. Now, I first met Alice Paul and Lucy Burns in 1911 when they led open-air suffrage meetings on the streets of Philadelphia. No permit was requested for fear the papers wrote all about these women meeting on the streets. And to arouse the interest of everyone, Miss Paul had many of the young suffragettes get up early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, and on the sidewalks of Philadelphia, these women wrote "Votes for Women." And when the workers came to work that morning, they saw those sidewalks of Philadelphia entirely written over. The newspapers, all they could write about was who was defacing the streets. What impudent women would do such a thing? But newspaper coverage, that kept the minds of the public on suffrage, and it didn't cost any of us a cent. Now, I was immediately taken with Alice Paul's energy and her initiative. This is what we needed, not just old women like myself. We had been fighting the suffrage battle for years. We needed new ideas. And that's exactly what Alice Paul and Lucy Byrne brought to women's right to vote. New ideas. Why, they had a parade in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd of 1913, the day before the inauguration of President Wilson. Women from across the country, they arrived in Washington and they supported women's right to vote. When President-elect Wilson arrived, the streets were empty. Where is everyone? At the Women's Suffrage Parade. President Wilson should have been warned that things were not going to be easy for him. But the newspapers, they wrote about the hecklers that the police refused to stop. But that did not matter, because to Alice Paul, women were talking about suffrage. And Alice was willing to try anything to draw the public's attention. However, she drew some very unwanted attention from the leadership of the National when she put at their convention a large banner. We demand an amendment to the United States Constitution enfranchising women. Demand? Why, the leadership of the National was so upset. Women don't demand. Women plead. And a federal amendment to the Constitution? The National, they were entitled to be able to look for this state by state. But it was a stroke of brilliance that Alice called this the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, recognizing that only by a federal amendment would women across the country equally receive the right to vote. And even more, Alice was holding the President of the United States, President Wilson, the party in power, accountable. And the National, they wanted to keep everything nonpartisan. The rift between Alice Paul and the National could not be mended. I found myself in the middle. I being a Philadelphian, and yet I had supported Alice and Lucy from the day they arrived in Philadelphia. And yet for years, I had had a friendship with many of those in the National. I made a choice. I would go with the young at the gates. So I severed the ties and committed my suffrage efforts to Alice Paul, Lucy Byrne, and the Congressional Union, which soon became the National Woman's Party, the Militant Suffrage Party. Deeds plus words. Now, our banners are beautiful. And our banners are of the colors gold, white, and purple. Gold, the torch of hope, white, the emblem of purity, and purple, loyalty. And yet, purple can also be called violet. Gold, white, violet, those first letters give women votes. In January of 19, we decided as the National Woman's Party to picket the White House, standing with our banners. No one had ever picketed the White House before, men or women. And yet, those shifts that we took through the rain, through the snow, through the cold, through the heat, it kept every day in the eye of President Wilson that he was holding us back by not supporting women's suffrage. When the newspapers became bored, our signs, our banners became more vocal. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? And then in April of 1917, the United States joined Britain, France, and Russia in the Great War against Germany. And Miss Paul began to use President Wilson's own words about democracy against him, recognizing the hypocrisy of saying that America was a democracy without making America a democracy for women. Now, for months, we were able to picket the White House in peace. But as our banners became more vocal against President Wilson, against what was happening, indeed, we began to be arrested. The first arrest was Lucy Byrne's. And Lucy Byrne, she having served in the end, 6 prison sentences. When I was arrested the first time, there were so many people being arrested that there wasn't even enough room for me in the Black Maria. That would be the coach that we were put in to be taken to jail. I had to sit on the matron's lap. When I was arrested on July 4th of 1917, I served 3 days in jail. The charge against me was obstructing traffic. Truly, the judge didn't know what to do with all these militant suffragists. Women would be arrested, we would serve a few days, then without any notice, we would be released or pardoned, at least in the beginning, until Alice Paul was sentenced to 7 months in jail. And the charge against her, blocking the sidewalk. When Alice was arrested, I made sure that we could organize more pickets, and one very large picket at the White House. Different states sent women, and they volunteered to come to Washington, D.C. Our goal was to have so many women arrested that we would overwhelm the prison system. We succeeded. 31 suffragists were arrested and sentenced. I received 60 days. But what none of us expected was the brutal treatment we would receive during the infamous Night of Terror. Allow me to tell my own harrowing story. Our sentences were to be served in Washington, D.C., in the district jail, where Miss Paul was being held and where she was on a hunger strike. But in the most underhanded of dealings, women prisoners were often sent 50 miles away to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia. And at 5 p.m. on November 14th, 1917, we women who had been sentenced were herded to a waiting train at Union Station. And when we arrived at Occoquan, 50 miles away, we were herded again into a room with no food offered, no water. We refused to give our names. We wanted to be treated as if we were political prisoners. I was the spokesperson. It was not until 9 o'clock at night that the superintendent of the jail finally burst into the room. I rose to my feet, ready to say, "We demand to be treated as..." That's as far as I got. I never got the chance to say, "We demand to be treated as political prisoners," because 2 guards a dark hallway. I was doubled over as if I was a sack of something, and I was thrown into a cell. I hit my head on the iron bed and lost consciousness. And for a few moments, some of my fellow prisoners thought I was dead. The other women received the same rough handling. I heard the sound of shrieks and cries and heavy bodies. And then Lucy Byrne was handcuffed to the door of her cell with her hands above her and left that way all night. most of us went on a hunger strike. After several days without food, both Lucy and myself were so weak that we were taken back to the district jail where Alice Paul was, so that we too could be forcibly fed. To be forcibly fed is a terrible ordeal. I would be seized, laid on my back where 5 people held me, my legs, my arms, my head, and then the doctor would force the feeding tube through my lips and down my throat, I gasping and suffocating with the agony of it. I didn't know where to breathe from. Everything turned black when the fluid began pouring into my stomach. I moaned and made the most awful sounds. When the tube was finally withdrawn, my throat was so swollen, I couldn't swallow. What must women suffer for freedom? The atrocities we were experiencing began to leak out to the newspapers, and 2 weeks afterwards, all the women, including Alice Paul, were released without any explanation. Miss Paul warned the reporters that what happens next depends upon the administration. And within weeks, President Wilson announced his support of women's suffrage. It was too little, too late. The Senate failed to pass a federal amendment. And then came 1918, and the Spanish flu. It reared its ugly head. The silent sentinels picketing the White House were truly silent. Our protests were paused. And public places, churches, schools, theaters, they shuttered their doors. Funerals were limited to 15 minutes. Masks were worn in public. And as one loyal supporter declared, everything conspires against women's suffrage. However, the Illinois suffragists bravely held their convention, closed to the public, limited to 100 participants. Seating was 4 foot apart. And yet, the women defied to wear masks. 1919, Alice Paul declared as Victory New Year. We began to light watchfires of freedom in front of the gates of the White House. And of course, once again, I was arrested. We even planned our most audacious protest. We planned to burn into our watchfires an effigy of President Wilson. The paper said it was a straw doll 2 foot tall. It was nothing more than a little paper cartoon of President Wilson. Burning the president in effigy, protesting at the gates of the White House. Are these actions militant enough to deserve jail? Decide for yourself. It was not until June 4th of 1919 that finally the Senate was being able to pass a federal amendment. It was only 2 votes over the required majority. Lobbying the states began immediately. Which states were going to accept and which states were going to reject a woman's right to vote. Alice Paul asked me to be able to serve as the national ratification chair for the Woman's Party, the militant party. I lobbied for ratification in Maine and Kentucky, as well as many other states. And if you're curious to know, Wisconsin was the first state to ratify the 19th Amendment. Massachusetts was the 8th state. Georgia, of course, was the first state to reject the ratification. And when I arrived in Atlanta to lobby, the power brokers were at a barbecue. I wasn't sure what that was. I told Alice Paul that in Philadelphia, we don't have barbecues. Well, it didn't matter. The prejudice and the fear of the enfranchisement of Black women made ratification in Georgia and many of the southern states impossible to combat. Now, to keep the ratification in the public eye, Miss Paul had a large banner created with the colors of the Woman's Party. And every time a state would ratify, a star would be added. 35 states quickly agreed, but then we came to the very last state needed, the perfect 36th. It was up to Tennessee. Success was possible, certainly not assured. I cannot tell you firsthand about the heat of the weather or the heat of the battle in Tennessee, as I was not there. But I can tell you, putting that last star, the 36th star, on our ratification flag came down to the war between the roses, the battle between the Suffs and the anti-Suffs. And it came to one vote, the vote of 24-year-old Harry Byrne. Now, Harry wore a red rose in his lapel when he arrived to vote on August 18th, 1920. As he sat at his desk waiting for the session to begin, he received a letter from his mother. His mother wrote, "Vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." The Tennessee House tied. A mother's advice is always best for a boy to follow. So Byrne changed his vote. The House was able to shift, and with that shift, the scale tipped, and the 19th Amendment was fully ratified, the perfect 36 states. 8 days later, on August 26, 1920, the amendment was signed into law. One vote. News of our victory quickly reached Woman's Party headquarters, and Alice Paul sewed the last star on our flag. The Woman's Hour has struck. Now, many people think that militant actions, such as I participated in, were not necessary. They think that jail and force feedings and protesting at the gates of the White House, that wasn't needed. Many people think that someday women would have received the right to vote without using these kinds of tactics. But when the Senate fell one vote short of passing the amendment, an irritated legislator confessed to me, Dora Lewis, you women being so annoying and persistent and troublesome, just like the sand that gets into your eyes when the wind blows. That is what has put this suffrage amendment on the map 10 years sooner. Our objective was the national enfranchisement of women. It has been a long and wearying struggle. Whatever disillusionment we have experienced, we have kept our faith in women. Real triumph belongs to the women. But to be sure, women resent deeply that so much human energy had to be expended for so simple a right, the right to vote. Thank you for listening today to me, Dora Lewis, National Woman's Party. Lindsay, I'll open the floor for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lindsay, it's Fran.
Hi, Fran.
Hi. I just want to say that I am so proud of what everyone did. I am so thankful for what everyone did. And what's going on now, I am very also proud of. I just wish we didn't have the violence element in it. But I agree with you, Dora, that the sand in the eye,
Yes.
that one little cut at a time, will get to them. And if I wasn't so darn old, I'd be right out in the streets too. But
Thank you.
thank you.
I will remind you that the oldest of the National Woman Party suffragists who was jailed and served her sentence was 73 years old.
A
The
little younger
young
than I
might be
am.
at the gate, but it is the old women like us who still need to be able to remember that our opinion and our efforts, no matter what they will be, still count. So thank you. Thank you.
Well,
Of
that's
course, we can't protest at the gates of the White House now because I think that's been moved back about 6 streets with barriers and so forth and so on with all that's going on. But again, this is very impressive, and I love your hat.
Thank you.
There's a question in the chat. Did your children support your mission?
Did my children support my mission? Yes, my children did support my mission, very much so. My daughter Louise, unmarried, she often would give some of her own money to be able to support the activities. They were not as active as I was, but they still supported their mother. I'm surely frustrated. My brother, and who was a doctor at Johns Hopkins, he seemed to think that my activities were much more than was needed. But nevertheless, whether family would support us or not, we make our choices.
All right, I guess you answered everything wonderfully. So this was so lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much again for welcoming me. And again, you should be proud there in Massachusetts, the 8th state to ratify. Not every state did, as you are well aware. So thank you.
That's great. Thanks again. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to Faloka for sponsoring today. We hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.